I think I've met pretty much everyone in the room, so I won't talk about me, but what I will talk a little bit about is Nevada Solutions, for those that don't know too much about us. So we've been around since 2016. We deal in the ICT consulting, app development, integration, design, and app managed service business. We're a Microsoft Gold partner, and we've been a Gold partner since 8 months into our business. We're also an Outsystems Premium partner and a Boom partner as well. And all our development and all our team sits literally 3 doors down at our offices. So we don't offshore. One of our value props is that everyone's welcome to the office to speak to technical guys anytime. And if you want to know a little bit more about Nevada Solutions, there's a little bit of a story on our website about our story, so feel free to tell you a bit about the journey about I'm going to spend probably less time. I'm going to try and get through this slide deck, because what I want to do is I want to start open it for open discussion and obviously lunch as well. But I want to share some insights about what we've seen and what Microsoft's seen in Teams, especially through COVID. Some interesting facts here that in 2020, Microsoft had 95 million users to Teams. It was the fastest growing app throughout the pandemic. It has currently 145 million active users. That's up from 75 million the year before. It had a growth of 894%. That's much more than Zoom itself. And over 500,000 organisations globally use Teams as their primary e-commerce channel. And it's estimated that Teams generated $6.8 billion in revenue in 2020. So these stats are a little bit old, but you can see the growth's quite large, and you've probably all noticed this within your organisation. And with that growth brings some challenges as well, mainly around how do we manage this beast as it's growing. So some of the things that we've seen in Teams over the years are things like cluttered directory tenancies. So people going in and noticing that you've got all these Office 365 groups not named correctly, hard to find, all these issues that you sort of uncover. And there's no real way, unless you have some sort of convention of identifying what these groups are and what they're meant to be. Team sprawl, people sort of creating teams off the fly, and all of a sudden you've got this sprawl of teams everywhere. And how do we manage that? So once a team's been created, do we have a end of life? Do we, what happens when a team's no longer required if it's a project team? So one of our clients, Catholic Education, has something like 70,000 teams in their tenancy. Like, you just can't manage that, right? Albeit they're using it a lot for their learning management system. But it's just massive. And you can imagine in a school, at the end of a term, that team needs to be cleaned up, needs to be re-provisioned for the next one. At the end of the year, they need to be deleted as well and removed. So what do you do with that archive? What do you do with that information that you're generating? You'll be constantly generating information and data within teams. Orphan teams. So all of a sudden, we have these teams that have no owners. So people leave the organisation, there's no owner of the team. What do we do with that information? Who do we go to sort of identify or answer the questions that we may need? Uncontrolled guest access. This is a big one for me as well. So by default, guest access is enabled. So we're allowing people from external organisations to have access to Teams, so we're sharing. But what controls do we have around who can actually access that information and what access should they have? How do we recertify that the person that we shared some information with in Teams still should be seeing that information? And how do we audit that, right? Who's given permission to allow someone to a certain team? And there's no distinction to sort of say, I've got a project team, so yes, I should be sharing, compared to how in the finance or HR team, and I shouldn't be sharing this information. So who makes those rules? No classification of data. So we spin up a new team site, we start putting information, documents, messaging. How do we classify that information? So if I'm sending some information to somebody else and it's just ephemeral sort of working document, that's fine. But what if it's information about team members? What if it's financial information or information that I'm under some sort of NDA with a client that I shouldn't be sharing? How do we classify that information and how do we put controls around that to make sure that there's no data leakage? Stale or incorrect information, just because I sent it once doesn't mean it's still relevant today. So how do I clean up? How do I make sure that the information that I've sent or I'm sending is still relevant and it's still current, the currency of the information? And the other thing we notice a lot of is because people have access by default to create teams, there's a lot of duplicate teams created, right? It could be a project team that's been spun up. All of a sudden somebody else within that project team spins up another one. And now I've got 2 areas to go to get that information. And we see this quite a lot. So there's no real way of identifying those 5 whys. Who, what, where, when, and who? 5 W's. Where? That's this morning. So Tracy picked me up on that this morning. So who can create the teams? How do we, what's the mechanism for going through the approval and so forth? So how do we govern, how do we go into organisations and help govern teams? So first of all, we need to have some sort of assessment of the current environment. There's a decisions workshop that needs to be done, and I'll go through those high-level questions in a moment. We need to communicate those changes, and then we need to implement those changes, and whether they are native tools within Teams or the Microsoft platform, whether they're third party, whether they're custom solutions that you may want to build yourself. So some of the initial decisions that we need when we're going through and trying to put a governance structure around teams is that first and foremost is who's allowed to create a team, right? And at the moment, on the bottom left-hand side of team, there's a created team. By default, it's there. Now, I'm making the assumption that some of your organisations in the room may have sorted that out and may have removed or only given access to a certain amount of people. And how do they create teams? Do we have a naming convention? So this is a big one for me as well, and this leads back to not necessarily the team itself, but how your Active Directory gets polluted with these team names. So is there a naming convention? So as an example, do we need to prefix project so we can identify, or PRX or PRT, to identify that it's a project team as opposed to a department team? How do we then start to sort and filter and look for these things? So that's a really big one that you might want to just think about before we go off and start creating teams. What apps within our organisation are approved to be used? So again, by default, over I think 1,100 apps within Teams. If you look on the apps that people can add to their teams. Some of those store data outside of your tenancy. Some of those have access to read information from your tenancy. So how are we sort of managing which apps can and can't be used within our organisation? Do we need to have any templates to make it easy for our users when they're going through and requesting a new team to be made? Created. Is it a project? Is it a department? Is it another type of team that we need that has all these predefined channels and these predefined apps and everything else? We don't know. And Microsoft has now the ability to create templates and things, so it becomes quite easy. Do we allow the maximum and minimum number of team owners? And by default, I always say you need to have a minimum of 2 team owners before you create a team. So there's no real way of enforcing that at this moment. And the reason why we say a minimum of 2 is because if one leaves, moves on, there's always that other owner you can go to. What happens when those owners are no longer there? How do we sort of promote an existing member to be an owner? How do we know when those people leave? How do we allow guests access to a team? So what are the controls around that at the moment? And how do we recertify that those guests should still have access to that information? Is it time-based? Is it by inactivity? Do we need to set an expiry date on teams? So the notion of leasing a team as opposed to creating and owning a team. So as I said before, you might have department teams which might need to live forever, but you've got project teams which should have an end of life. Do we need to classify information in Microsoft 365 to be able to classify the documents and protect that information? Do we have that in place today? Do we need to think about information barriers? So this is an interesting one too. So just because you all work for the same organisation doesn't mean that you should still have access to this. Everyone should have access to that particular information. Some examples there are education. So students in one school are able to look up contact details for students at another school. So Catholic education, large tenancy, single tenancy, 163 schools. Natively, you can search profile and find information from everyone else. Do we need to have barriers around that? Another example is legal. If you've got some cases happening, do you have the same people within the organisation sharing that information? Government. Do there need to be controls across groups or departments? So those are the sort of things that we need to sort of think about. Data retention. So this is an interesting one. By default, people go, we'll keep the information, it's just there. But there might be some really good reasons why you don't want to retain information. So some examples are we need to comply with industry regulation or legal requirements. You know, how do we configure those? There may be, as I said there, data that may be considered a liability if we kept it after the time that we should be retaining it. How do we archive teams? What does archiving mean for you as an organisation? Does it mean that we just remove access and it just becomes read-only? Does it mean that we delete the team and then move that information elsewhere? And when we talk about information, it's not just the documents and files. What about the conversations and the decisions within those conversations that have been made? How do we archive that and how do we refer back to that if need to be? How do we monitor and manage things like orphan sites, right? How do we manage and monitor inactive teams? Team's been created, hasn't been active for X amount of months. Does that mean that the team is no longer of value? And do we have the required licenses and permissions? So some features that you want to enable may require additional licenses, whether they're Microsoft licenses or third-party apps as well. So we need to think about those. Insert summary. So, like I said, some of those things that we need to workshop those above decisions. We need to communicate those changes, assign correct licenses, configure policies. The big one for us is about how do we automate a lot of these governance solutions. It's one thing to have a governance framework that says that we should be doing things. There's another one to sort of say, well, we can automate, say, 80% of this. Automate as much as possible. And how are we managing that teams? So a couple of things that we think about is when we're doing these workshops, who are the people within your business that need to be involved and what do they need to be involved with? So information management should be dealing with classification, protection disposal policies, naming conventions, archiving strategy. Information technology should be managing the teams, should also be involved in the recertification of users. They should also be asking the questions of who can create and who can approve, ongoing management and monitoring. Information security needs to be involved around classification, protection, guest access, recertification. The business definitely needs to be involved as well. So quite often it becomes a technical sort of discussion, but the business needs to be involved because they're the one that's using it. So they are the ones that will, again, answer things like the team templates. They're the ones that are answering, yes, we do need guest access to certain teams. They're the ones that can be answering that who can be approving. And again, legal should be involved as well to answer things like guest access, information barriers, retention policies. Now when we do these workshops, it's not about having just one workshop because too many rooms, too many people in a room, you're not going to get the right answers. You start to go to the group think as well, so it's a bit of a process. So the communication within the business as well. So some things we look at is making sure that we have some sort of racing matrix as well. So that racing matrix will tell you about who needs to be responsible, who needs to be accountable, who needs to be consulted, and who needs to be informed. And that's across the whole project as well. So not only throughout the initial governance discussions, but post go live as well. That's really important. We need to be thinking about who we need to be communicating with, what they need to know, how do they want the information as well. So it's one thing to have a deemed successful project because we've delivered on time and on budget, but if people don't adopt it, if people don't use it, if people rebel against it, it's a failed project, right? Saving money, go do something else. So how do we get them involved? We need to get them involved in the very beginning. And people consume information differently. So some want to see an email, some are happy to jump into a lift and there's a poster about what's coming up. Some might want to do brown bag lunches, do these boardroom sessions, bring your lunch and we'll present. So it's about identifying how people want to be communicated with as well. That's a really big one from us around the change management piece. Policies and settings and teams is enormous and somewhat confusing. So, making sure that we communicate what those policies and what those settings and what the impact of those mean. So as an example, we have a look down here around external file sharing. So you have the ability to turn on Dropbox, turn on Box, turn on Google Drive, and other native third-party services within Teams. But the impact of that is that data is no longer stored in your tenancy. Now that could be okay if you have the right governance structures around those third-party tools. But again, if you don't, recommendation is think about that before you turn them on. Again, like I said before, there's over 1,100 approved apps in Teams that your current workforce can go and enable. Like I said, some of those allow them to read information about your organisation. Some of those allow them to store data outside of your organisation. How do we approve those? How do we vet those? We don't want to turn them all off because that sort of defeats a lot of the purpose, but we want to control and maintain those. Team site classification. You might say department teams are not allowed guest access, but project teams may allow guest access. Now by the virtue of Teams, it's either on or off in the GUI. So how do we then make sure that we control it to sort of say, there's a request come through, project team, need access, gets approved, that particular team and that team only can have guest access. That's not very easy to do in the interface in Teams in the admin center. Like I said before, making sure we have naming convention, expiry dates, owners. There's a lot to consider, and this is just a very small subset. I was going to take a screenshot of all the settings, but I realised we'd be here for another hour going through all those settings itself. And bearing in mind the settings that you see in the GUI in Teams is a subset of what's available programmatically as well. Do we need to assign licenses? So as an example, communication compliance needs an an uplift in licenses or an add-on in licenses. Are there any third-party tools that we need to help us? So do we need to look at these third-party tools as far as managing and maintaining? And then again, these third-party tools require some controls around them as well. Some of them will allow you to read information, some of them will allow you to change information in your Teams and Microsoft 365 environment. Again, another insert summary. So, sensitivity labels. How do we go around classifying, whether it's a simple one for public, internal, private and highly confidential information? You know, have we got those set today? Do we have a default setting that all information is classified as internal, and then what policies are around those? DLP policies out of the box in Microsoft 365. Have we looked at those? How do we ensure that credit card details are not being emailed or sent in messages or stored in files? And what should we be doing around it? That's an example. Passports. I've got a client that we're doing some work with today that we need to scan passports to do some AI or some cognitive, using cognitive services to identify people. So we're storing, believe it or not, passwords and driver's licenses, a lot of PII data. So if we do have DLP policies, how do we ensure that that particular part of the environment is not affected by those policies? How do we then go and make sure that that information is safe and secure and auditable? And there's an audit trail around who can access that information. As I said before, automating a lot of this is really important because we can put all these controls in the world in place, but if we don't have some sort of way of automating this, we're just going to be spending more time and effort maintaining this than actually getting value out of this. So we've got a couple of services that we offer. This is the book, the sales pitch now, around a way to automate the creation of teams. By having, and through that automation, it also goes through an approval process, creates a naming convention, sets all those policies in place. How do we manage and monitor existing teams? So again, we have a solution as part of that that does that monitoring and management of teams. Reporting, recertification of guests. I've allowed Angus into my tenancy, he has access to information. What if Angus leaves his current employment? His identity is still in my AD. So how do I recertify, again, to make sure that he has access or he should have access? The same as teams, making sure that a team is still required. Managing orphan sites, creation of sensitivity labels, DLP policies and much, much more. So we do have a Teams managed service that can provide assistance around that as well as that automated governance tool that we provide. So that's pretty much it that I want to go through today.